afternoon, everyone. I'm Salwa Ismail, Head of Library Technologies at Georgetown University Library, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to this special program. We're thrilled to be joined by Cal Newport, Associate Professor of Computer Science here at Georgetown. Cal is here to discuss his newest book, Digital Minimalism, which explores how casually society adopts alluring new technologies. Digital Minimalism, which you will have the opportunity to purchase at the end of this event, is meant to be an indispensable guide to anyone seeking to cultivate a focused life in an increasingly noisy world. All those cell phones, tablets, and laptops, and all those social apps. In addition to researching cutting-edge technology, Cal also writes about the impact of innovation on society. He's the author of 6 books, including Digital Minimalism and the bestseller Deep Work, which argues that focus is the new IQ in the modern workplace. Cal's writings and ideas have been featured in the New York Times, NPR, the Wall Street Journal, The Economist, The New Yorker, and more. Without further ado, Cal Newport.
So I'm just now having this insight. I could have made my students come and made the book required reading. So I'm terrible at this book marketing thing. I have such a leverage at my hands right now. So my apologies in advance. I thought warm weather meant you're not allowed to get colds anymore, but my 3 kids are like germ magnifying machines, and so if I collapse on stage, let's just pretend it's because of my fervor for the topic, not rhinovirus. So I figured what I would do is talk a little bit about why I wrote this book, what's the story behind it, right? How did I come to it? And then I like to give some observations. Typically when I give these talks when I'm in the middle of my tour, though it's a little bit weird to be where I work on the book tour, which is very convenient. I like to give some observations about what are some things I've been noticing. And so typically, like recently, what have I been noticing when I've been on the road about how people are responding to the book, what's catching people's attention, what surprised me. And then I thought I would add a sort of extra coda to this that I don't normally talk about, but I figured since I'm here at Georgetown where I work, it might be interesting to talk a little bit about why, as a computer scientist and an academic, I write books that are non-academic. So I figured that would be the plan. And then we'll do questions, and we can make questions the priority. And if I don't like what you're asking, then I can lecture on theoretical computer science. So one way or the other will fill the time. We have whiteboards. So how did I come to write this book? It's helpful to rewind a little bit to 2016. So in 2016, that's when I published Deep Work. So that came out in 2016. The right way to think about Deep Work, at least as it's relevant to digital minimalism, is that it's a book that is about some of the unexpected consequences of technology on the workplace, right? So I'm wondering, by the way, I could probably free myself a little bit. I mean, am I audible back there? Yeah. I'm a professor, I'm used to wandering. So Deep Work, in some sense, was about unexpected consequences of technology in the workplace. And so it talked about how things like low-friction digital communication, like email and Slack, was having these consequences on our ability to concentrate, and that there is an actual sort of economic consequence to us losing our ability to concentrate. And so the book actually talked quite a bit about concentration as being something that is important. So I put this book out there. I go on tour. I do a lot of interviews about it, and I kept getting this feedback from people that was essentially saying, "Okay, maybe I buy your premise about these unexpected consequences of technology in work, but what about our life outside of work?" And this is what people kept coming back with: is like in our personal life outside of work, there seems to be something going on that we're not happy about. And this is definitely something that seemed to be picking up steam, let's say in the last 2 years or so. Something in the last 2 years or so, people really begin to have this growing sense of unease about the role of technology in their life outside of work. And so I started to look into this. I wanted to understand what was going on. And one of the things that immediately became clear is that the issue is not utility. So when people say they're uneasy about like what's happening on these screens in their life outside of work, the issue they're having is not what I'm doing when I'm looking at this screen is worthless or I don't like it. Right? That doesn't seem to be the problem. It's not like cigarettes or cigarette smoking where people would just be happy, sorry to wander back to the mic here, where people would just be happy not to do it at all. Actually, what I'm doing, if you grab, and we can look out these windows, I'm sure we'll see someone on a phone somewhere, we could grab them and say, what are you doing? They'd probably report there's some value to it. So what seems to be going on? Well, when you push people further, the issue seems to really be about autonomy. So this seems to be what's going on. It's not utility, it's autonomy. So what people seem to be increasingly uneasy about is this idea that they're doing this more than they should, or that they're doing this more than they know is healthy, or they're doing this to the exclusion of things that they think are more important. Right? So it's almost a sense of diminished humanity. Sort of the quality of my life is diminished by how much I'm doing, not that everything I'm doing on here is bad. So that's one of the themes I picked up pretty quickly when I was out there studying it. So then the question is, what do you do about this? And so to answer that question, you need to understand two things. Why is this a problem? Like, why is this happening? And then two, what works for getting around it? And so, what I found is that there was lots of people who for years now are out there giving tips and they're giving tricks and they're giving hacks for how you spend less time looking at your phone. And we've probably all seen these same articles, right? Turn off your notifications, that's one you hear a lot. Don't bring the phone into the bedroom, that comes up a lot. Digital Shabbats are popular, right? Take a break from technology, like one day a week, one night a week, don't use technology. When I was out in Silicon Valley a couple weeks ago talking about the book, everyone seemed to be putting their phone into grayscale. This is a thing. You make the screen black and white, and then maybe it'll be less appealing, right? And you'll use it less. That's the idea. By the way, I'm always very nervous going out to Silicon Valley because I don't know how welcome I am. I'm always looking over my shoulder for Mark Zuckerberg. It actually turned, by the way, just as an aside, it turns out that I found out when I was out there that I actually have met on many occasions and until recently the head of Facebook. So Zuckerberg is over all the products, but the person who runs Facebook I actually knew, and I didn't know that. But he just stepped down, so point to me, I guess. How's that work? But back to what I was saying, there's plenty of tips, there's plenty of hacks, right? That's all out there. And we've seen the same articles, they're written again and again. It didn't really seem to be doing anything. Right? It wasn't really making a substantial change to people who felt like they were uneasy about their relationship with their digital tools. So then you go out there and you study people who seem to really have a handle on this, who seem to be using tech real intentionally, they seem to be happy about its role in their life, and typically they're doing things that are more drastic. That what they actually have is some sort of underlying philosophy. We can call it a philosophy of technology use, that's the phrase I use, but a philosophy that gives them a consistent way of tackling the question of what tech do I use, how do I use it, why do I use it? Right? So the people who had fundamentally different relationships had these stronger philosophies. Well, I'd seen this before. What seemed familiar to me about this was actually food and fitness. Nicole talking there. You look at food and fitness, we saw something similar, where we had a rise of suddenly hyper-palatable foods and junk foods arising in the mid-20th century. We got an obesity epidemic in large part because of this. We found that tips about eating healthier and moving more didn't get the job done. Who were the people that got really healthy? Well, think about the person you know who's the most annoyingly healthy person you know. They probably have some philosophy, right? Like they're vegan or paleo or something that's based on their values and gives them a very consistent way of thinking about something like food. That's how they're able to actually have a strong stance against the cultural forces pushing at them. So the idea behind digital minimalism is that the people who are having success with technology in their personal life tended to have some sort of deeper philosophy based on their values on which they approached tech. And so I gave a name to this philosophy, though I certainly didn't invent the philosophy and I wasn't the first to apply it to technology, but I call it digital minimalism, which is a word that's easy to type, and as countless interviewers have discovered, it's more complicated to pronounce than you think. But this is something writers don't think about. Minimalism, it seems easy enough, but it's hard. So I call it digital minimalism, but basically the idea here is you take the ancient notion of minimalism, which is an idea that you can go back and see Marcus Aurelius talking about this, you can see Thoreau talking about this, you can see the voluntary simplicity movement of the 1960s talk about this, you can see Mary Kondo talking about this. I didn't know much about her until recently, now I know a ton about her. Turns out she is popular. I get asked about her a lot. All of these people are applying this ancient idea of minimalism, which is a philosophy that says in many human endeavors, you're better off focusing your attention on a small number of things that you know for sure are really valuable, as opposed to trying to take some of that attention and spread it out over other things that are less valuable. Right? Focusing on the big wins, put it more simply, tends to leave you better off than trying to scatter that over many more small wins. And so you can apply this to your closet, right, and get rid of the things that don't spark joy. But you can also, as I've discovered, apply this to your phone. And so this is what these digital minimalists were doing, and it's what I talk about in the book, is that essentially they get in touch with an answer to the question of, like, this is what I care about, this is what I want to spend my time doing, especially outside of the work context. And then they work backwards from that to deploy technological tools. And so the question they always ask is this tool one of the best ways to use technology to help one of these things I really care about? And if the answer is no, they say I'm happy missing out on it. I don't care whether or not it has some value. If it's not giving me a big win on the things I care about, I'm okay missing out on it. And if the answer is yes, they say, okay, I'll bring it into my life, but I might put some fencing around it. So I want to know, like, how am I going to use it? When am I going to use this? I'm not just going to open myself to unrestricted use of technology. That's essentially the digital minimalist approach. They're very intentional about their technology. They deploy it at the service of very specific values, and because of that, they get a big win out of it while avoiding a lot of the potential downfalls of unrestricted use. And so I wrote this book that explained how we got to the place where everyone is uneasy, and what this particular solution of digital minimalism was, why it works, the type of things to think about if you're trying to embrace a more digitally minimalist life. And it also includes, and this is something as an academic I was a little bit uncomfortable with, it actually has a 30-day process in it, which is not the type of thing I would normally write about, but there's actually like a 30-day process for trying to do this sort of decluttering of your digital life. And the reason it's in there is that it works. So what I found is that it's actually really difficult to take your digital life and pare it down to something that's really intentional. And I ran this sort of informal experiment a couple years ago, where I had over 1,600 people go through this process. And what I found is actually having that much time to really step away and reflect and figure out what matters, and then rebuilding carefully digital life, you really need something like this amount of time. So I've been out there pushing this sort of relatively large transformation process, but actually put aside a full 30 days to sort of reinvent your digital life. So that's where the book came from. Those are the basic ideas of the book. So what have I learned being out there talking about it? Well, one thing I've learned being out there talking about the book is that of the various things I outline, probably the thing that seems to be resonating the most with people is what I uncovered in my research about how we got to a place where we look at our phones all the time. So we think about that as being somehow fundamental to the technology, right? You know, you have a smartphone, it's ubiquitously connected to the internet. Like, that's just how we naturally are going to use it, right? We're going to look at it all the time. It's an interesting thing. But if you actually go back and look at it, that's not how we started with these devices. I mean, if you look at the original iPhone, it was not intended to be something that you looked at all the time. It wasn't sold as something that you were supposed to look at all the time. Social media was not invented as something you're supposed to look at all the time. It wasn't used that way. So where did this behavior come from? Well, as best as I can tell, it was essentially created by the social media companies. And there was this transition point. There's some interesting research on it, but there was this transition point when they were getting ready for the IPO. So in particular, when Facebook was getting ready for its IPO, was this big transition point. They had to get the revenue numbers up, right? Because they had to try to get a big win, a big return for their original investors. So they had to get their revenue numbers up. And so what they actually did is they went through a re-engineering of the social media experience so that it was less about you posting, your friends posting, and you reading what your friends posted. They re-engineered the experience so it was much more about this constant incoming stream of social approval indicators. So things like likes and tags and favorites, and this was a completely, this was like a change to the service and how it worked, but it changed it from this more static type of thing to something where every time you checked it, you could get a reward. And it was a reward, it was about you. This was intentional, and it was basically from this transformation that we got that behavior of like wanting to check this all the time. And so that essentially retrained us to see our phones as something that we use all the time. And once we were retrained, we became used to it. So that's an interesting thing to keep in mind, is that this behavior of constantly using phones is itself relatively recent and is itself relatively contrived. The other interesting observation I've had being on the road is that journalists hate Twitter. So if you're curious about that, when you talk to journalists, once they are off mic or off camera, they feel completely obligated and completely unhappy with how much they have to use Twitter. And I would say the final, these are just sort of like recent observations, the final thing I've noticed is that professional athletics are getting interested in this. So just as like an interesting aside, I talked to a lot of people from various professional athletic front offices in sort of recent weeks and recent months. So I think in professional athletics, they're starting to get more interested in this notion of this has an effect on this, and this has a huge effect if you're doing something really cognitively demanding, like performing at the professional level in elite sport. The complete concentration matters. And so this is a change that's starting to bubble up in professional athletics. They're starting to worry about, let's say, the way that athletes use phones. So just as a sort of insider thing about what's going on out there, that's something I found to be interesting. Okay, so that's digital minimalism. That's roughly what the book is about. Those are some observations I've had from the road. I'll say briefly, why am I, as a computer scientist, writing books on these topics? The way I see it now is essentially like I am a technologist, and so it makes sense for me as a technologist to also do some thinking about the impacts of these technologies on our culture. And so with deep work and with this book and with the new book I'm working on now, I'll specifically tackle this intersection of technology and culture, because I think we need as many voices as possible trying to understand these things. And I think technologists themselves, we have our own sort of interesting views on what's going on and what we can do about it. And so, people like to refer to, they used to refer to me as having two careers, right? Well, you have these two careers, you're a professor and a writer, and so part of what I'm trying to do is get that to come across more as one career. That it's actually two natural facets of one career as being sort of intellectually engaged in technology is not just developing technologies, but also thinking about their impact. And so that's something I've been trying to work out, but I think Georgetown's a good place to actually have those type of intersections. Okay, so that's what this book is about, and I am happy if anyone has any questions. I'm happy to take any questions that anyone has. Yes, right up front.
Are you a proponent of renaming the phone? Because it's more than just a telecommunication device.
Yeah. Oh, that's an interesting question. Like, give it a different name because it's used for so much. Yeah. I haven't thought about that particular idea, but the underlying issue there, I think, is an important one. There's this interesting article I came across where someone went back and reminded us that the original motivation for the smartphone, right, it was a business-facing product at first, and the original motivation was productivity. Because if you go back to, let's say, like the early BlackBerry days, if you were away from your office, laptops were big, and this was before Wi-Fi was like very widely spread, right? So if you were away from your office, you really couldn't do much. And so the whole notion of a smartphone is we can put like some communication and some basic sort of stuff you would do on your computer technology in a phone, and then you can get some work done beyond the office. And so like the interesting point in this article I found is, okay, that's no longer the case. We have laptops that are smaller than pads of paper. We have tablets that are incredibly lightweight that can do all this type of stuff better. And so we don't really need them to fill that role anymore, right? You're better off just bringing a light tablet with you on the road if you're in business. And so they had to, if you're Apple, you're Samsung, you have to figure out in some sense, okay, how do we get people to need these, right, when it's no longer a business proposition? And that's where we get a lot of the sort of invented use. And so this is why there's such a focus on camera quality, for example. That's a way to get people to use these. The social media companies completely cracked how to get people to take out a phone all the time and look at it. So it's a bit of a divergent answer to the question, but yeah, the original purpose of this is no longer there. The purpose we use it for now was largely invented, a lot of it in response to how do we get more time and attention from a revenue perspective. But anyways, I'm a big fan of dumbing down. I had this op-ed in the Times earlier in the year where I was saying more people should go back to Steve Jobs' original vision for the iPhone, which is it takes a couple things people really love to do, like make calls and listen to music, and it made the experience great. And it was this tool that did a couple things really well, and that's probably a better way to use a phone than sort of the current way, which is this always-on portal to all information that you must always be checking. Yes?
So now electronic devices are becoming like a social hazard, like in life. And so, do you think is there a role the government should or can play in this? Like, I mean, against these companies, like maybe bringing some regulation, or so. Like, what should be done?
Yeah.
I mean, we can do something, but what about the general?
I mean, I know some of the people who are at the forefront of the push for various regulations. And what I can say is I'm yet to actually hear a particular regulatory philosophy that I think is going to have a major impact on the things that people really seem upset about. And I think this is in part a sort of PR agenda, so maybe this is a little bit conspiratorial, but so what I've noticed being on the road, talking to lots and lots of people about their experience with phones, like what they like, what they don't like, compared to what, let's say, you're seeing in news coverage of technology, right, is they're talking about two different conversations. And so I think if I'm, let's say, PR at Facebook, what do I want the conversation to be about? I want it to be about privacy, like what's happening with our data. I want it to be maybe something about content regulation. I know Mark Zuckerberg had an op-ed a few days ago in the Washington Post about I would be okay if there was some sort of third-party censor that was in charge of monitoring all social media information, things like end-to-end encryption and secrecy, like these type of things. That's what I'd want the conversation to be about, because those are things you can maybe do something about, right? You can actually change the features of your product. But the thing that really seems to be upsetting most people about their experience with social media is not some subtle notion of sort of differential privacy, it's that I'm looking at this thing too much. They can't talk about that issue, because that's the whole business plan. Like the whole business model is we have to get you to look at this as much as possible. We can't, if we're Facebook, we try to solve that problem, we're going to put ourselves out of business. And so I'm wondering I mean, I've seen almost an embrace recently. This has been the strategy of the social media companies, is they've turned around and are embracing regulation in some sense. They're saying, like, look at the GDPR in Europe, which has tons of problems, some of which is like it actually doesn't have a completely coherent definition of privacy in it. What it mainly seems to have done is made it so that like you have to click, I accept your cookie policy on every website you go to. Mark Zuckerberg is saying, oh, that's a good model, we should do that here. I don't know if this is true, but I suspect in part the reason why they're focusing on the areas that could be captured by regulation is because those are areas that they can actually do something about or look like they're making progress without hurting the core business of we have to get people to look at the phone a lot. And so there's probably room where some regulation could be important. It's kind of a complicated issue, like which regulations would be good and which would be counterproductive. But I keep coming back to the point that when I talk to people who are unhappy about their phone, they never say, I hate this thing because my data portability is not guaranteed under federal law. Or they're not saying, I hate this thing because of the data format in which my data is being stored and the databases is not sufficiently private or I'm identifiable. They say, I hate this thing because I'm looking at it when I'm with my kids. I don't know why. Or I'm looking at it in the car, even though it's like putting my family in safety, I feel so compelled to do this. I'm angry because I'm getting these screen time reports from Apple. And it's saying I'm looking at this thing 6 hours a week. Like I could do a lot of better things with 6 hours a week. And so I'm just interested in this mismatch between like the public is upset about sort of the addictive nature of the phones and how it makes them feel, and the public conversation is about sort of these more legislative, technical type issues. Yeah.
So I have a couple questions. First, as you're well aware, we have the Internet of Things that's coming online soon. Have you thought about whether the trend with digital tools like smartphones might continue if, say, your refrigerator, your car, whatever it may be, is also connected to the internet? And it's also something you can check periodically.
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, more things will be connected to the internet, more things will be generating data. Because data is valuable, so the more data streams we can get, the better. in terms of how that's going to change people's day-to-day experience, and in terms of the things that are upsetting them now, let's say, about their current digital experience, I'm not quite sure. Right? I mean, am I going to compulsively check the refrigerators? I don't know, maybe. And there might just be like a general sense of unease about, okay, everything can talk.
If you can watch videos on the refrigerator, maybe.
But I can't quite, it's interesting,
Yeah.
I can't quite suss out
Yeah.
IoT yet, right? Like I don't have a great philosophy on what it's going to mean, other than it's probably going to have ramifications. So I just find it a hard one.
Then the second question was, so I enjoyed deep work, and you talk a little bit about your own habits and how you structure your day. I'm curious, now that you've gone through this process of digital minimalism, what do you find is the biggest obstacle to doing the deep work and doing the writing that you like to do?
Right. Well, so, like, for example, I had this article in the Chronicle of Higher Education last month that maybe got me in some trouble because they ended up titling it "Is Email Making Professors Stupid?" When I was told it was their most read article of the year after it took about 1 week for it to be the most read article of the year. But that's actually, so it's a topic that's what I'm tackling in my new book, actually. But I think one of the things that, for me, so I don't use social media, for example, so that's not a problem. I don't web surf for the most part. I don't even believe in using bookmarks because I figure if a website's important enough for me to check, I should remember it. So like I don't actually spend a lot of time looking at my phone or looking at computer screens. But email obviously is a huge issue. And so this is a whole other talk. It's a whole other book. The book I'm working on now, by the way, the working title is A World Without Email. If that gives you some sense. It's like somewhere between the fantasy genre and business. It might be the first to ever put those two together. But real quickly, like what I think, the theory I'm developing here is that essentially, and this is essentially like a bit of a technological determinist type idea, right? So there's a sort of big split in the philosophy of technology between technological determinists and technological instrumentalists. And so the instrumentalists think, the technology is like essentially completely neutral. Like what matters is the cultural and social forces acting on the people that use them and on the people that invent them, and that's how you can understand technology. And then the determinists think, well, technologies can actually have these big impacts that are kind of unplanned and unexpected, and they seem almost spookily autonomous, right? And so I think we had something like that with email. So when we introduced low-friction digital communication, for various reasons, it upset, the way I would think about it as an engineer is that it upset the dynamical system we had of work interactions. It upset it and got us to sort of nonlinear, unpredictable response, where it completely changed how we worked. And it changed how we worked so that like everything, two things happened. One, so we're in this constant, ongoing, unstructured conversation became how we worked. No one decided that. That was just emergent once the technology was there. It also significantly increased the number of stakeholders that now have access to your time and attention. So this is why, like in an organization like at Georgetown, you can now, compared to 30 years ago, there's a number of different groups and organizations and whatever on campus that are now, you need to fill this out, we need this from you, look at this, whatever. It also explodes because there's this sort of balance between what's the friction in getting in touch with this time and attention, what's the value we get. And so I think we've inadvertently created a whole knowledge work sector that is not working very well because we're constantly communicating and we're doing much more stuff than we used to do. And this is all completely mismatched with how brain psychology works. And so I talk about in deep work that there's these sort of huge costs to context switching. If you need to use your brain to produce something valuable, there's a huge cost to switching your attention, let's say, to an email inbox for even a minute. The time doesn't matter. But switching to the email inbox and coming back gives you this long-lasting attention residue that reduces cognitive performance. And so there's this I think there's a complete mismatch between how our neural hardware works and the work environment we've set up. And I would go so far as to think this is a factor at play in the fact that in the non-industrial sector, so non-industrial economic productivity, so the formal economic metric of productivity, excluding industrial productivity, so looking largely at the knowledge sector, has been flat for at least a decade. And throughout this whole period, we've made communication, and information retrieval faster and more flexible than ever before. Billions have been invested. And instead of us getting more productive, it's been flatline. And I think that's in part is because we accidentally created this mismatch between how our brains work, which is we need undisrupted focus on one thing if we really want to produce high cognitive output on that thing. And the need to constantly check in on all these communication channels makes that almost impossible. So it's like we're accidentally and persistently reducing our cognitive output. And so like email is a big thing. I'm thinking a lot about it. I'm writing a lot about it. I think it's email and the problems it caused, I think, are something that's ripe for revolution. And I think there's going to be massive changes probably in the next 10 years in knowledge work. That's a long answer to a short question. Yes?
In many different settings, we hear a lot about the importance of networking and how to be engaging, whether with audiences, whether that's in person or online, and more and more we see the presence online. And from like the professional career perspective of when you're applying for jobs, you get a lot of questions about your social media platforms and your LinkedIn profile, and questions about your Twitter account, and not having a strong digital presence online can raise like suspicions, questions sometimes. What do you think about that question?
Yeah, so probably of the various articles I've written, the one that got me yelled at the most was in 2016. I wrote this was again in the Times. I wrote an op-ed that said, your social media presence is not as important to your job as you think it is. And young people should stop spending so much time on their social media presence. Actually, they'd probably be better off putting that time towards other things that are useful to the job. And people hated it. I mean, this was really interesting. It was to the point where the New York Times actually commissioned a response op-ed for the next week. So like they went out and they got the head of something at monster.com or something like that to write an op-ed about why my op-ed was wrong because they're getting such pushback. Like it was, but interestingly, so I put that up there, and that came out right after the presidential election, right? So this was the same week. I think it was like the weekend after the presidential election. By the end of that year, and I'm kind of dodging your question to talk about something else, but I'll get back to it. At the end of that year, there's this like small video, this talk I had done at a TEDx about why you should quit social media that had just been languishing. Went up really viral, like millions of views. And I think there was this turning point in our culture that happened between like November of 2016 and the beginning of 2017, where people's relationship with social media kind of changed. And I think what happened is up until the presidential election, most people had a sort of uniformly but vaguely positive association with social media. It's high tech, it's of the future, it's sort of part of this exuberant bubble that's been happening. It's been helping the stock market rise since the recession. And just like it was weird or eccentric when people like me said, don't use social media, right? And I think what happened, my theory is the election, so the Donald Trump election, on all sides of the political spectrum, gave people like really specific things that got them upset about social media. And so if you're on the right, there were certain things that got people upset. If you're on the left, there were specific things. And I think that changed the place where people were categorizing social media in their brain, right? And I think it shifted it from universally good to something that could have flaws. And then once it was something that could have flaws, people started thinking, well, wait a second, how am I using it, this or that? And so I think there was like that article that got so much trouble in, that was like the last of the age of, I think, sort of uniform. Generally speaking, this is probably good, it's weird to be negative about it. So I was using your question as an excuse to talk about that's when I think things changed. Back to your point, I think in a lot of job situations now, it would probably be a plus if you said, no, I don't use it, whatever, I'm too busy focusing, or like I find it distracting, right? Like I'd rather focus on these type of things. That's become countercultural and positive. And so that's what I would say. I would also say in many fields, this was the original point of that article, in many fields, it's overrated the degree to which people think that their social media presence is important, or the role it plays in networking. In a lot of cases, I think it has been exaggerated to some degree. And I think the trade of the average US user using almost 2 hours a day of social media, I think the advantages you get from that, if you took those 2 hours a day and let's say instead applied those to other forms of networking, or even better, like improving certain skills that were really valuable in the industry, would be probably a 10x more valuable. So I remain. I'm an author without a social media presence. It turns out you can still sell books. I was told I couldn't, but it still worked. Well, since I asked you before, I'll really go to someone I haven't called on yet.
It's funny because it seems like from the perspective of social media companies that minimalism actually falls under like centralization of different social functions. So like you could have just one app to do a lot of different things. Yeah. In this new age of people becoming more or demanding to become more autonomous over their phones, do you think that compartmentalization is like a good way for tech companies to adapt.
All right, so spell that out a little bit more. So if I'm a tech company and I wanted to embrace compartmentalization, like what might that look like?
So for example, like after reading Deep Work, actually, I was able to get all the social media apps off my phone, but the last one was Facebook, and the reason I was able to do that is because Messenger, you can actually have Messenger without having a Facebook account.
Yeah.
So that's kind of an example, I guess.
Yes, okay, so I think that would be really useful for users. I think they're really worried about doing it. Because I think, at least, I mean, and again, I'm just looking at this relatively small sector, which is like the attention conglomerates. But basically, the core to their business model is the ecosystem notion. So you enter the ecosystem, like the Facebook ecosystem, because there's something specific that you need to do, like Messenger or something. Like they regret making Messenger separate for exactly this reason. So you have something like, well, I use Messenger, it's how I talk to this relative, or something like that. But what they want you to do is say, well, now I'm in the Facebook ecosystem, so as long as I'm there, let me look at the news feed. As long as I'm looking at the news feed, let me go here. And it's just like Instagram is doing really well in part because it's hard to take it off your phone because you need to use photos on Instagram. And well, that's where you take your photos, right? And so they keep you on there because you want to see your niece's photo or something. But then you're in the world, and then they can grab you for, I mean, Facebook products now consume about 50 minutes per day of the sort of the average user. So I think compartmentalization is great. And in fact, it's actually what I preach for just doing it yourself. And so all the case studies in my book of Digital Minimalist, they're really big on never just saying I use this service or I don't use this service. Like they would never be so vague. They always say how and when do I use it. And so like in the book I talk about for visual artists, Instagram is really important. Because a lot of artists post work and work in progress on Instagram. And if you're an artist, what you need, like the fuel for being an artist, especially in the visual arts, you have to see a lot of other art. Because that's the raw material that fuels your own creativity. And so Instagram is like democratized art because it used to be you had to live in Soho if you wanted to be a really good artist because that's where all the galleries were. Otherwise you just couldn't see enough art. Now Instagram, you can live anywhere, right? But a lot of visual artists I talk to went through this sort of minimalist process. They say, okay, I use Instagram for that reason, because that's important to me. But I only use it, how am I going to use it? Well, I'm not going to use it on my phone. And I'm going to curate who I follow down to like 10 artists that are really important to me. And I have a schedule, maybe I check it Sunday night on my desktop computer. And so you see a lot of this sort of self-compartmentalization where people come in and say, I can get a big win. Facebook's group is another one. I profile a bunch of different students, for example, who, I run this group, at my campus, and we use Facebook groups like to organize. I have to look at Facebook groups. And so they'll do something, they won't have it on their phone, and they'll use like a browser plugin that scrubs the news feed. So that they go on the Facebook and all they see is the group. And so like, this is great, I'm getting this value out of it, and Facebook is not grabbing 50 minutes of my time every day. And so I call it in the book the attention resistance, but there's this like whole group of people who are really careful and use a lot of tools about how do I go and like do these surgical strikes on these platforms, and self-imposed compartmentalization. Get out what is really, really useful to me without allowing the rest to sort of get its hooks into my brain. So I think users should definitely do it. And I think in particular, attention economy companies hate it. Yeah.
I'm really interested, you mentioned your kids earlier, and we talked a lot about how to pare down your technologies once you're used to technology. But how do you kind of raise a digital minimalist? How do you approach introducing new technology into their lives?
Yeah. So one of the things I've been hearing from a lot of parents on the road, for example, is modeling is crucial, right? And so it's like almost impossible to, I mean, you can lecture all you want and put Cal Newport on audiobook on car trips, which multiple parents have done. So my apologies. I've gotten notes from multiple parents who have, yes, there we go. Yeah, you put it in the car. I don't narrate them, don't worry. Yeah. But if you're looking at the phone all the time, it's really, really hard, right? So one of the things that seems big among parents, and the reason I'm a parent, but my kids are young, right? So I'm really learning. I'm learning a lot from parents whose kids are older because it's relevant. Like my 6-year-old doesn't have a phone; it's not really relevant. But if I had a 16-year-old, this would be much more important. And so this is one thing I'm hearing from them: is modeling is really important. So I wrote this article not long ago on my blog called "Digital Minimalism for Parents," and I talked about this one idea that multiple parents had told me, which I thought was really interesting, which is essentially when they're home after work, they don't keep the phone with them. It's a simple idea, right? It's what we used to do, but it can seem scary. But you put it on like the foyer, like near the front door. And, like the idea is if you need the phone for something, like You go there to the foyer and you look at the phone. It doesn't leave there. Maybe you have it plugged in there. Or if you're expecting a call, you can have the ringer on. You know, you used to do. And you go and you get it. You go and you get it when it rings. And if you're having like a text conversation, well, you have to keep going in there. Whatever. Like it's a bit of a pain. But your kids don't see you with the phone as a constant companion, which is incredibly important. So, you know, the thing about that is a pain, but basically, as I said in the article, like that's basically the definition of parenthood, right? I mean, like the whole thing is inconvenient, right? I mean, everything you do as a parent is inconvenient, right? It's not a game to get into if you're looking to avoid inconvenience. And so this idea was something I thought was really interesting. So something as simple as what you model is like, I don't have the phone with me in the house. Like suddenly that sinks. The other thing I've been hearing, and this makes me feel good, is that there seems to be this growing sort of countercultural rebellious movement among teenagers to step away from social media. Like the tide is shifting from like, this is a cutting edge thing we're doing and parents just don't understand it, to we're really getting exhausted from this and I'm kind of looking for an excuse to get away from it. And so I've been getting some notes, and we were talking about it earlier, but I've been getting some notes from parents who have actually, you think this would never work, but it has. They've sat down with their teenager, they've talked about like digital minimalism or something, right? Here's what's happening, here's how Instagram is sort of harvesting your attention for data, here's sort of what you're missing out on. What do you think we should do as a family? And I'm getting report after report of 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds saying, okay, I'm done. Like, great. I was looking for an excuse, I was looking for an explanation for why I don't have to use these anymore, and they take it off the phone. And so, yeah, we'll see. I think our culture is going to shift on it. I mean, depending on which way the research literature ends up finalizing, the research literature on mental health in teens is starting to focus some, but psychology literatures are very complicated. If it keeps in the same direction it's going without major correction, I think like within the next 5 to 10 years, the idea that a teenager would have like social media is going to be something we just don't do anymore. But in the near future, I'm sort of buoyed by some of these stories. Yes?
So I work at a tech company, and Slack is, all the rage, and people are on it. Everyone is on it all day. Drives me crazy. So I figured out my strategy, but a couple of things that it really helps with are, one, people who are more introverted and are less likely to talk or raise a point in a meeting will feel free to do so in Slack. And it also democratizes problem solving, because it makes it less hierarchical and everybody can dive in and solve a problem together, and many times solve it really quickly.
Yeah.
So is there like a philosophy of digital minimalism for working groups in terms of how to get the best out of it? But
yeah, well, this is essentially the new book. So the other problem Slack solved is the ever-filling email inbox is something that really clashes with our sort of Paleolithic social machinery. So it's a huge source of unnecessary, just the idea that like there's an inbox filling with communicative obligations causes a lot of stress and anxiety because just the way our brain is wired. So Slack also solves that problem because it's synchronous, and so it doesn't build an inbox, and so that's part of the relief it gives. So what's the problem with Slack? So basically what Slack is doing is taking our ancient instinctual approach to coordination, right, and implementing it digitally. So what is our instincts for how we should work is we should just have an ad hoc unstructured conversation. Like, this is what we would do in the Paleolithic if we're hunting a mastodon. There's 4 of us. We would just, you go that way, I go that way, you sort of read the situation, it's flexible, it's adaptive, right? That is our instinct for how to communicate, and so Slack sort of implements that. What the research literature shows is like, yeah, that's great for like up to 5 people. But if you try to scale it up to, let's say, an organization with hundreds of people, it all breaks down. Because now it's just too much communicating to try to keep up, and things get lost, and the brain is completely fragmented. So one of the things the future I see is I think we need to get away from just sort of a global approach to coordination within knowledge work organizations where we just take the 5 hunters on the savannah and say, let's just do that writ large in the whole organization. We're all in email, we're all in Slack, everyone can talk to everyone, because it just doesn't scale. And it requires too many brain cycles just to constantly manage and be a part of these conversations. And it's very difficult to extract yourself from the conversations because you're needed. If this is how we coordinate, is through unstructured ad hoc communication, that's problematic. Within the scope of small teams working on something, synchronous communication is very powerful. Right? So like the ability, like here in my team of 4 and 5, we can sit and go back and forth and do the sort of synchronous ad hoc thing is very efficient. And so I don't know exactly how to engineer a solution, but I could imagine a future in which at the scale of teams, there's a lot of back and forth unstructured communication helped by low digital networks. When you talk about communication between teams though, or other units in the organization trying to communicate with the teams, that there's going to be a lot more structure to the channels and a lot more friction and a lot less direct access. This is like they used to do at Bell Labs, right? You had these offices with doors that would shut, and it would be you and 3 other people would go into this office and figure out transistors or what have you. But outside of that, it was sort of hard to get people's attention. So anyways, I'm still trying to work out those dynamics, but basically, if all you're doing is managing these conversations, they're incredibly adaptable, they're incredibly flexible, it's very convenient. But it's just really ill-suited. If you're doing that all the time, it's really ill-suited to then taking your brain and actually creating the thing that ultimately needs to be created. So I think we're going to have more of a segregation of at what scale we do that, and at what scale do we have a sort of much more battened down type of protocols and friction for communication.
Yeah, I mean, you can do that with channels. So there's probably a book or a how-to guide that needs to be written in terms of how many people and what channels for what purposes.
Yeah, yeah. Or like if a computer science professor could write a book called World Without Email that could spell this all out. Yeah, but something that's I'm still trying to figure it out. But yeah, and also what that highlights is the tool's not the problem, right? Like Slack is like they have a pretty good infrastructure for synchronous digital communication. Email protocols is sort of like a very nice innovation for asynchronous low friction digital communication. The thing where the problem comes from, the thing that needs to be fixed is what's the underlying workflow? What's the underlying agreement on how we manage obligations, who does what, how we assign it, how we execute, how we check up on it. That's all governed by some sort of implicit workflow. And if the answer is, well, we'll just have this ongoing conversation and figure it out on the fly, that's when we get into trouble. Yes?
So I have a question about, generally about the idea of patience and how technology has made us really impatient. So for example, Netflix, you can stream an entire series. You don't have to wait a week to see the next episode. Or just the way our attention spans are kind of being primed in these 2-minute clips of, video content. And also like the ability to always find the answer, if you're out and being, thinking about a thing instead of being bored. Like what is boredom now if it's not just sitting on your phone? I was wondering if you could speak to some of those things.
Yeah, well, so the thing about boredom is that it's a strong drive, right? We don't like being bored. It's unpleasant. So there has to be a explanation for it, right? So boredom, sort of historically, and I'm talking on sort of like the deep history scale here, right? Would, among other things, drive you to do useful things that maybe require some expenditure of energy. Like I am going to go do art on a cave wall, or I'm going to build a spear, or something that's like kind of a pain, right? But I don't like being bored, so it drives you into activity. So it's actually problematic then when you invent this sort of perfect technology that just with like a touch of a button can kind of just dispel boredom. Because it just algorithmically can select based on a data profile generated around your past behavior, just a perfect thing to show you that's going to be novel, some sort of novel stimuli. The problem is when you can kill boredom just with that press, you no longer have that drive pushing you to do these sort of harder, more skilled, but ultimately sort of more fulfilling things. Because the pairing with boredom was we also get a sense of deep satisfaction when we actually like take an intention and make it manifest concretely in the world. So it drives us to do interesting things, and those interesting things make us feel better. If you dispel the boredom with the press, you never get the reward of doing the interesting, hard type skilled things, and this is really actually a problem. And so if you don't have sort of high quality leisure activities, I call them in the book, but things you just do for the intrinsic quality of the activity, right? Just in itself, it feels satisfying. We know all the way back to Aristotle that this is like a key part of living a resilient and sort of flourishing life, even amidst all the ups and downs you can't control. There's things you do just for their quality, require skill, you can get better at it. We're losing a lot of that, especially with young people. Just skilled activities, social activities that are hard and skilled but meaningful because we can dispel the boredom. And I do think I think that's actually a problem. And then the other problem we get from this is there's a lot of benefits to having periodic time alone with your own thoughts. And so I have a whole chapter about it in the book, but like the long and the short of it is if you demolish every last moment of where you could possibly be alone with your own thoughts, not processing stimuli, it makes us anxious. So we have this sort of like persistent background state of anxiety. We especially younger people have this sense of there's this kind of this void in their life where like, what am I supposed to be doing with myself and my time? But you kind of paper it over with like, if I just do this enough, I can escape from having to face it, but it's still there. And the existential void is, it's right over there. And you're kind of you're blinding yourself a little bit, but you're still feeling that pull. And so it's like one of the scariest, but also one of the biggest rewarding parts people get when they do this digital, especially younger people, this digital minimalism transformation is the scary part is when they step away from this, because I asked them to do that for a month. It's part of the process. It's terrifying at first. Like, what am I supposed to do? But if they persist and really work hard at figuring out what do I really want to do instead, they're often surprised by, wow, that's really rewarding. And it's like we've lost touch with that. And so I think messing with boredom in the way that we did with these things, hijacking the boredom drive to generate data for a small number of companies to get their stock price up. So sort of hijacking everyone's boredom drive to take all this time and attention away and ossify it in the stock price has been problematic. And it's leaving like a whole generation sort of vaguely unhappy and anxious.
Yeah, and then with the patience issue, with being able to not have to wait on things, do you think that it makes what we consume less meaningful because you just end up going through and not really focusing?
Yeah, this has been commonly reported,
Okay.
right? Like, that effect of now, like when you go on Netflix,
Yeah,
like
exactly.
you can't find like the exact thing you want to watch, you're like really unhappy. And it used to be you go to the video store, and, well that's gone, that's gone, that's gone. This is kind of interesting, right? Like I mean,
Yeah.
just think about, my wife and I talked about this, we were real cinemaphiles before, kids. But we saw everything. Like that,
Yeah.
we in Boston at the time, there's 5 or 6 theaters we would go to,
Yeah.
and none of them are things, maybe like 10% are things I would now click on Netflix. And I think there's a problem with that probably, yeah.
Paralysis of choice.
Yeah, in the back.
Yeah, going back to the Slack question a little bit, and you're kind of touring around the country. Have you actually come across any like companies or institutions that actually are like training people how to use these tools in an effective manner? Being in an apartment here, I'm always kind of blown away with just no one knows how to actually like effectively send an email to like not have these reactions where you get kind of annoyed or why we would even use Slack for
Yeah, not nearly enough. But I think that's going to change, right? I think it's going to change. We're not very good at using these tools. We don't have a lot of structure around how we're using it. It's hard to find a lot of good examples. Some of the examples are ironic. Like, there's this social media thing, TikTok, which I guess is like the epitome of like time-wasting social media. Supposedly, their headquarters, though, they don't use email, they don't use Slack, and they're doing something that's really smart. And so I'm trying to figure it out. Except for I just gave a lot of bad quotes about them to a paper in Canada. So I don't know, like I'm trying to get in there under the wire and find out about this before they hate me. There's not a lot of this going on. I think we're going to see a lot of this going on though. And because I've seen this, if you look at previous intersections of technology and commerce, you see that there's these long learning periods where we do things kind of naively, and then someone puts in the time to figure out how to do it better, which is almost always inconvenient, requires more money, requires more overhead, and has hard edges. Bad things happen, right? You got to be willing to do all those things. But the first person who does all those things and makes a lot more money, then suddenly the whole industry changed. And that's exactly what happened with Henry Ford's assembly line. We used to build cars in a way that was incredibly natural. Like, there's a team building a car right there, another team is building another car right there. If you want to scale up, you get more teams, right? Just people are building cars in place. The assembly line was incredibly complicated compared to that, incredibly inconvenient. You had to hire new managers, you had to build all this equipment, and it was also really hard to get right. If you didn't get it just right, bad things happen. Like the steering wheels are getting here too fast and they're piling up or whatever, right? It's a huge pain. Figure out how to get to work right though, produces cars 100x faster than what they were doing before. So I think that's what's going to happen with digital communications in the knowledge workspace. They're like much more highly structured approaches that allows people to use their brains, produce a lot more value, and not be burnt out and miserable, are going to be inconvenient and require more investment, require more overhead, and it's going to cause a lot of bad things to happen. And that's why I think we see very little change. But the pressure is building up, and so I think that dam's going to burst soon. Yeah. Okay. Are we still okay on timing? I don't know what I should.
We're still okay.
What should I be shooting for?
We have time for about
two more questions.
Excellent, yeah.
Yep.
Here.
Hi, I read back-to-back Deep Work and Digital Minimalism, so I kind of have them mixed up in my brain. But as an elementary school teacher, when I read these kind of books, I start thinking a lot in the different situations I see in the classroom. So with Deep Work, you know, most of the examples are adults that either retire, and I think you talk about 2 different ways to reach that Deep Work. And then I was wondering if you know or read or have done any research about specific learning disabilities, kids with ADHD, and how can we help them get to that deep work when it's not necessarily a decision that they make to focus and you know, avoid the shallow and get to a little more deeper work. And that's the first thing I was thinking while I was reading the book. And then the second thing I was thinking and asking myself is if the structure of the school of having a class and then a class and then a class and then this and then promotes deep work in the school structure. And I don't know if you know or have thought about that.
Yeah, so they're both good questions. So the intersection with deep work and ADHD is really interesting. And so
I'm sorry, because I was going to add that I've read a lot of books and there are different, like, you know, I've read about 45 minutes of seating and working and 15 minutes break and, you know, different strategies for that situation. And then I read deep work that it's really promoting a long chunk maybe of time for you to really get, you know, able to get there.
Well, I mean, like the interesting thing about ADHD is for a lot of people who have talked to me about this, one of the regularly consistent behavior in ADHD is this ability to go into what they sometimes call the hyper-focus mode, right? Where it's this weird back and forth between where stimuli can very easily capture your attention. But when you're in a situation where you can lock the attention, you can actually sort of do super heroic concentration, right? And so like in deep work, I talked about this guy, Peter Shankman. I didn't mention the book that he has ADHD, but he does. Oh. And he was writing a book deadline, and what he ended up doing was he booked a round-trip business class seat to Tokyo. And he wrote, got to Tokyo, got a cappuccino at the airport, and then got back on and flew back to LA, and he finished the book in this 30-hour period. But he was, like, by taking the distractions out, he was able to focus incredibly intensely, right? And so a lot of the things that are making it hard for just most people to concentrate make it really, really hard for people with ADHD, right? And so if you're particularly attuned to things that can do attention capture, our current environment in schools and in life and in general, especially with phones, makes it much, much harder. But on the other hand, if you look at the sort of structured approaches, like the students I used to work with, I used to do a lot more in study habits with ADHD. It's very structured approaches like you're talking about, where it's very structured to how they do the work, where the information is. You can actually learn a lot about that. Like what they set up that allows them to go into the hyper-focus mode is actually something that's probably useful for anyone. So on the flip side, thinking about it. So I think there's something to learn from that community, and then there's a lot of what we're doing now that makes things very hard for that community. And in terms of schools, I mean, this used to be the function of schools, especially once you get to like the college level, was how do we teach your mind to do something which is pretty unnatural in our deep history, which is concentrate for a long time on abstract things, right? That's not something we spent a lot of time doing. And actually one of the primary tools we used for training that ability was long-form reading, right? Long-form reading is like incredibly unnatural. It's very, very hard to learn. I'm teaching my 6-year-old now. It's like very difficult to learn. You're hijacking parts of the brain that weren't designed to do that. But once you can teach your brain to read and you do a lot of it, it's really like you're doing pull-ups, right, for your neurons, right? It's like you're doing this sort of very artificial but highly effective training of building up abstract things, holding them in your mind. And so like I like to think that inadvertently all the reading you do is sort of setting up to teach your mind to do focused abstract thinking. And so it's why I get worried when we kind of, we break things up into smaller chunks. Or we move away, oh, this is old-fashioned, like maybe you could do like a YouTube video instead. Or like undergrads, I mean, really, if you have a phone near you, anything while you're while you're trying to study, it's like you're drastically reducing the effectiveness, but also like the cognitive training you're having if you keep breaking up the attention. It's like bringing Doritos to the gym as an athlete or something, right? It's like cross purposes. And so I think, and there is a lot of schools that are thinking about this. And in fact, there are some schools in this area where, you know, I know some of the administrators, and it's things that's really on their mind. What do they do with phones? How do they explicitly inculcate concentration as a tier 1 value? How do you model that? How do you design curriculum around it? So it's a whole rich topic, I think, education in depth. And there's a lot of people now who are thinking about it. All right, we need one more question. Yes?
So my question was related to her question. Like, okay, maybe in business they no longer need like social media presence, but like if you want to get married, like if you want to date or something, everybody will ask about like, you know, your past, and they want to see your social media. And if you don't have that, which I don't, and then it's a problem. They will ask, you know, like, like is there something you're hiding or something? You know, like what's that? So what do you do like in that kind of
yeah, I know.
setting?
There was like some article recently about like we shouldn't give out phone numbers, we should give out Instagram handles because like it has like more information. And the guy who sent it to me, he titled like this is a vision of a boring dystopia. That's the way he described it. I think that's kind of right. Yeah, I mean, okay, but it also makes you more interesting, right? I mean, like yeah, I don't use social media. I'm not judging you for using it, but it just doesn't seem that interesting to me. Here's what I do that is interesting. I actually think it's kind of it's a distinctive thing. But yeah, I do get that. I was just doing an interview before I came here, and the guy's a pretty prominent entrepreneur, and he has multiple phones because he's very worried about his attention. So he's like, he doesn't want to have a phone near him that like he can get this type of distraction doing this type of work, and he says it's been very problematic with his girlfriend because she just assumes the reason why he doesn't have his phone is because, you know, he doesn't want like his other girlfriend to call her. So I've heard this could be dangerous, but the thing is you'll be so productive that, you know, you'll be rich and famous, and then from all your extra focus.
But you won't have the inconvenience of the kids. Like the inconvenience of the kids will not.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. You won't. No one will date you if you don't have social media. But then, then you won't end up with kids, and you can focus. So there you go. It all connects. All right. Well, thank you very much for coming. I really appreciate it.